Hello everyone, my name is Wändi Bruine de Bruin and I'm a Provost Professor of Public Policy, Psychology and Behavioral Science at the University of Southern California. In this presentation, I will talk about a paper entitled Measuring Subjective Probabilities, the Effective Response Mode on the Use of Focal Responses, Validity and Respondents Evaluations. This is a paper I wrote with Katie Carmen at the Rand Corporation, and we published it in the journal Risk Analysis. And I want to thank our funders at the National Institutes of Health. So as you may know, if you ask people about the probability of different things happening in their lives, you get a lot of 50% responses. So for example, on this slide, you see responses to a question asking participants, what is the probability that you will live until a specific age? This is asked on the University of Michigan's Health and Retirement Study, and it gets a lot of 50% responses. There is a blip at 50 in this response mode. Now, when I was a PhD student, I asked people probability questions in interviews. So for example, I asked, what is the probability that a person will get AIDS from having protected sex once? And I would get answers such as, I don't know, 50-50, because there's always that possibility that something like the condom would break or something. So this quote suggests that this respondent is using 50%, not as a number, but as a don't know response. So I wrote my PhD thesis about this topic and continued working on this topic. And two highlights from this work are that 50% is more likely to be explained when participants use it as meaning no idea or no one can know the chances rather than a good estimate. And more so, that is more the case with 50% responses than with other responses that people give. 50% is a response that is also more likely to be used by respondents with lower numeracy, who will presumably have a harder time thinking of what number to use. Initial work with student samples suggests that open-ended response mode may elicit more 50s than visual linear scales, but that was with student samples, and Katie and I wanted to see if this held in a nationally representative sample. So we recruited people in the Netherlands through the LIS panel, and participants were randomly assigned to an open-ended response mode where they could fill in the blank, or one of two visual linear scales that I'll show on the next slide. So the visual linear scale was a line between 0 and 100% that participants could click on. And the visual magnifier scale looked the same as the visual linear scale, but once they clicked on it, a magnifier appeared that allowed them to give an even more precise response. So we asked, how do these visual scales compare to the open-ended response mode in terms of the use of focal probability responses such as 50%? On this slide, you see that the open-ended responses elicited a lot of 50s. There's a blip at 50% in response to the question, what is the probability that it will be very cloudy in your town tomorrow? There are fewer 50s with the visual linear scale, and you can see that the bar that represents the 50% responses is partly white and partly black. The black parts reflect people who clicked on 50%. The white bar reflects people who clicked near 50, between 49.5 and 50.4, without clicking on 50. And with the visual magnifier scale, you also see that it has relatively fewer 50s as compared to the open-ended response mode, and even fewer people who click exactly on 50. We also looked at response validity. Now, if people give an answer to a probability question, you want the probabilities that they give to be correlated to other outcomes that it should be correlated to. So for example, we also ask people, what is the probability that you will get the flu this winter if you get no flu shot? And then, so they answered this question in the different response modes. The participants who received the open-ended response mode gave probability responses to this question that were correlated to having a flu shot in the year before the survey, to intending to get a flu shot during the next winter, and they also reported ending up getting a flu shot in a survey that we conducted a couple of months later. So the probability that people gave for getting the flu this winter if they get no flu shot was positively correlated to each of these three outcomes, suggesting that the open-ended responses were valid. But the answers on the visual linear scale and on the visual magnifier scale were more strongly correlated to those outcomes, suggesting that those scales elicit more valid probability responses than the open-ended response mode. And we saw this, if there were differences between the response modes, it tended to be the case that the scales elicited more valid responses. So, in conclusion, we recommend the use of visual linear scales with probabilistic expectations questions because, compared to the open-ended response mode, both visual scales reduce the use of 50%, as well as 0 and 100%, which have also been identified as focal responses that people tend to use a lot. And this effect is especially true for low numeric respondents, suggesting that visual linear scales help even low numeric respondents to be more precise. And this precision leads to increased validity, so it's not just noise. So validity was good for each response mode, but it was actually the best for the visual linear scale. And participants also liked the visual linear scale the most, even though I didn't show it. If you want to see this, you can see it in the paper, and you can request a paper from me in the email address that is shown at the bottom of this slide. Thank you very much for your attention.